I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work I've done related to loneliness. But I think mostly what I'd like to do is to talk with you about some of my thinking about why loneliness. And where does loneliness fit in our thinking about quality of life, about people's experience, and from my perspective about the theorizing that we do and don't do about aging and have done and not done over a very long period of time. So we can take loneliness in a foreign land in many ways. I want to say thank you, though, to Mike, to Mary Pat, to Christina for inviting me. It is wonderful to be here. Although coming into Heathrow, I think for many of us can feel like coming into a foreign land. Once you get out of Heathrow, it feels very comfortable for me to be here. So let me begin by talking a little bit about a comment made in a recent paper by Andy Achenbaum, who was talking about our theorizing about aging. And he was talking about an early theory of aging that I think connects here, at least I'm going to try to connect it to our conversation about loneliness. And he talked about, this is an ESRC funded series. Achenbaum started his paper by talking about a 1948 pronouncement about what was then the US equivalent to ESRC. It was called the Social Sciences Research Council. And in that 1948 pronouncement, which could make me despair about how well we're doing, he quoted the head of this SSHRC as saying that there needs to be a much more central emphasis placed on social adjustment in old age. We've done very well in our medical and biological theorizing about old age. We don't understand the social. And here we are, what, 60, almost 60, 70, whatever it is, years later, still thinking about social aspects and adjustment or lack of adjustment in old age. As you gather, or as you may gather, I'm particularly interested in theorizing aging. It's become much more of a personal issue as I've gone along the life course. So now I have credibility. So Emma, don't worry, you too will get there. And you too can poke at other people's theorizing about issues of aging. So we're still trying, I think, to theorize issues of aging, and I think loneliness has got a very interesting place in all of that. So I am interested in the theoretical. This article by Achenbaum was also interesting in that he was talking in that context about one of what was really the early theories about aging, and I must say a theory that's in a long line of prescriptions about what a good old age would look like. Now, presumably a good old age doesn't look like the kinds of things that Emmy was talking about: profound loneliness, isolation, alienation. And yet, that early theory of aging, which some of you who've worked in gerontology, who've taken courses in aging will know, was called disengagement. Now, disengagement theory was prompted, according to Achenbaum, by evidence that suggested that some people in old age are not very connected to people and places around them, and yet they seem to be perfectly content. Kind of the antithesis, it seems, of loneliness. The major premise of disengagement theory, the prescriptive part, was to live a good old age. When you got to that advanced age of 60 or so, you graciously withdrew from work, from being too actively involved in your community, from the people you knew only peripherally, and you moved away into a more contemplative, separate life, which some people would say could be the precursor to a lonely and isolated life. So here we are. What's loneliness all about? Where has it come from? Those of us who've been on this professional academic career for a while know that things come up. Ideas, concepts come up and have currency for a period of time. Loneliness is definitely one of those. I mean, this is the country that has had this national campaign to reduce loneliness. So the question that always comes to my mind is why this and why now? And is it particularly about here? So here are some ideas that to me have got me thinking about loneliness and its place in our theorizing. I must say, in part, they were prompted by a wonderful invitation from a colleague who I think was here as part of your series, Jenny de Jong-Gierveld, who's one of the gurus of loneliness research, has developed one of the scales, the loneliness scales, that has been much used around the world. And she invited me in. And when someone like Jenny, who's done this wonderful work on loneliness, invites you in to work with her, you say yes. And so it was a wonderful journey with the two of us, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But the questions that come up, or at least have come up for me recently about loneliness, have to do with why it is that I and we might study loneliness. A lot of the work has been very solid empirical work. Why might we want to do this? Well, loneliness is a very private, personal experience. We in the social sciences have had a long tradition of making the private public. There was a book written by Newby, just came out last year, on the state of social science research. And he harkens back to C. Wright Mills, who talked about the importance of elevating private troubles to public issues. It seems to me that loneliness is a good example of us doing just that. But then the question arises for me is whether doing that is something we wish to do. And I'll come back to this work that Jitka, is she still here? Where is she? There she is, has done on self-fulfilling prophecies of raising issues, and then people buy into them. Making the private public. Well, over the years, sometimes we do this and sometimes we don't. There's a very famous situation in Canada when the last Prime Minister, Trudeau, was the Prime Minister back in the late 1960s. And he made a statement that I think is apropos here. He said, "The state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation." So his argument was, you stay out. The private is private. Loneliness may be one of those things. Now, he was talking about an omnibus bill that decriminalized homosexual behavior between consenting adults. It was not until then that we made that change. In that same bill, access to contraceptives was deemed to be legal, where it had not been previously. Stay out of the bedrooms of the nation. Keep the private private. On the other hand, and in a sense, Eichenbaum, as he talked about disengagement theory, was saying the same thing. You know, your life should be private. You get to a certain point in your life and you should disengage. Whether loneliness comes with it, I'm not sure. But then we've got this lovely article, and if you haven't read it, you must read it. Is loneliness in later life a self-fulfilling prophecy? At least two of the authors are here, Yitka and Christina. This just came out, it's hot off the press. And they talk about how there are a lot of stereotypes about aging, and that many of these become self-fulfilling prophecies. That is, as we grow older, we too know about these stereotypes about aging, and in fact, we buy into them as part of our being good citizens. So they say, at the most basic level, stereotypes are characterized as assignment of individuals into groups based on some distinguishable clues. Everybody knows that old people are lonely. The assumption that everybody in the group shares the same characteristics, that is, we're all lonely, and that people compare their circumstances in old age with what they expected. So I take that as a warning to those of us. This is where I'm poking at people, and I hope you'll respond back. Then maybe we should stop stirring the pot, because it seems to me the last thing we want to do is visit on a whole cohort of people the idea that loneliness is something they can expect in later life. And if they feel lonely, well, that's just what one should do in later life. So, do we make the private public? Maybe Trudeau had the right idea. Stay out of the private lives of citizens. But maybe there's some other more positive things about theorizing about loneliness that really are important and that we should do. And I think there's been a fair bit in the recent research on loneliness about how loneliness may result from not having sufficient social capital. So here's the other concept. Social capital is a situation in which you have strong relationships with a number of different people, which you can draw on when you need them. There's certainly an assumption these days, unlike the disengagement theory, that satisfying social relationships are one of the building blocks of a good old age. And we do worry about people in later life losing some of those strong social relationships. And in fact, there's been a fair bit of practice, certainly in my country and elsewhere, about helping people create new social relationships in the face of relationships that may have been lost through death or illness or moving away. And the being in a new place is one of those. Can you rebuild your connections in a new place? Vrippy Timmerman has a new book out where she's talking about how we theorize aging and how we have these paradoxes of aging in which on the one hand we say everybody should be socially connected in later life, and on the other hand we see older people as a group being isolated and dependent. It's a very good read, this little book. It's just out by Policy Press, and like Amy is suggesting things you should read and see, I can add to your reading list if you're bored and lonely and need something to do. So building social capital, you know, is that something we could argue against? Is it important for people to be socially connected? Where does loneliness fit in this argument? Is loneliness an indicator, or could it be taken as an indicator of not having sufficient social capital? Could it be seen as an indication that older people aren't doing their part to build and maintain their social capital? Agency is a concept that runs through a lot of our theorizing about later life. But another piece of work that has been used a lot in recent years, and I think is in an attempt to stop blaming the victim, as we tend to do in later life, older people aren't doing their part, is the idea of social exclusion. I've done some work in this area with Tom Scharf, and many others have worked in the area of social exclusion as well. That suggests social exclusion is defined as the lack or denial of resources, rights, goods or services, and the inability to participate in the normal relationships and activities available to most people in a society. Think about the person who's an immigrant, who's in a place that's a new place for them, although there are many other excluded groups. Homeless people are another one. Is it your fault? Or is there something about the community, the culture, the society around you that says you are not welcome, you are not really a full citizen? Think about our stereotypes about aging in terms of full citizenship. So social exclusion may be another concept that could be important for us to look at. I find it particularly useful when looking at some of the broader social policies in my country and elsewhere around what are the things that frame people's experiences in later life, and how much does loneliness result from some of that broader framing of life. And if we're thinking about loneliness, what do we do with isolation? Those two tend to get put together very often when we're talking about later life, certainly, and when we're talking about loneliness. The disengagement theory didn't ever, as far as I know, address the question of loneliness. The issue, though, was about separateness and perhaps about isolation. Do loneliness and isolation always go together? I'll never forget an early piece of research I was doing. It was actually on retirement, and I was interviewing a man who'd recently retired from being an elementary school teacher, which I can't connect with anybody who could spend a whole career all day long with pre-adolescent children and come out of it sane. So we were talking about this. We were sitting in the library in his house, and we were talking about retirement and this separateness. And we were talking about some of these issues, really about loneliness, and he said, I am happy. I am here with my library. I can read what I want, when I want. I can go out when I wish to. And I don't have any people in my life who are shorter than this anymore. So he was isolated, and at least at that point in his early retirement was quite happy. If we're going to do theorizing, we do have to have some conceptual clarity around some of these ideas. I know when I go to sub-Saharan Africa, where I work with some people there, I often hear a discourse about how we in North America and Western Europe are really terrible to our old people because we make them live by themselves, or at least they don't live with their children. And it makes me think a lot about our views about social connections, about relationships, and about loneliness. So isolation may or may not be related to loneliness. The title, at least part of the title for my talk today, came from a a very provocative phrase developed by Alex Kalach, who some of you may know was a former director of the Institute for Aging at the Life Course at the World Health Organization. He often was saying provocative things about issues that he thought were big ones. Kalach, I think, when he made this statement, mostly was talking about people who have come to a new country and are finding and find for the rest of their lives that they're never really entirely at home. But we could think about aging and perhaps loneliness as something even more profound or more universal than that, in a sense that as you grow older, there are lots of things that one leaves behind. Now, sometimes you happily leave them behind, like my friend with the teaching of pre-adolescent children, but some are things that you leave behind quite unhappily. In Canada, we're very interested in issues of immigrants and of issues of immigrants aging in a new place, because like many countries in the world, we have been and continue to be a nation of immigrants. When Yenny and I were doing the work for this paper that I think is in your folder, one of the things she asked me to do is look at some of the statistics on the proportion of people over 65 in Canada who were born outside of the country. I did that, and at least 2 years ago when we were writing this paper, it was 30%. 30% of people over age 65 in Canada were born outside of the country. That's a pretty large proportion of older adults. So in fact, yes, we are a country of immigrants and continue to be a country of immigrants. But aging in this new land, well, let me back up. And I think for a long time in Canada, we have believed that immigrants have a particularly difficult time throughout their lives, but certainly in old age. And that when it comes to loneliness, immigrants are lonelier than people born in the country. That was the basis for beginning this paper, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But we've got some parts of our history where we have excluded people who have become, as a result of that exclusion, profoundly lonely and disenfranchised. And those people are not immigrants at all. Those are the people who were there long before we European immigrants came to Canada. First Nations people, Aboriginal people in Canada have come to the top of agendas in Canada recently because we are finally beginning to recognize that history. And I was prompted to add a comment about the exclusion of aging Indigenous people to my presentation today because of an article in our national newspaper just last week in which an older Aboriginal man talked about his loneliness. The history in Canada for the last 100 years has been of an attempt to make sure that Indigenous children are part of the mainstream culture. And we did this for many, many years by taking children from their families and putting them in what came to be known as residential schools. They were taken away from their families, they were taken away from their culture, they were not allowed to speak Indigenous languages, eat the food that they were used to, or communicate with their families. It was only in the 1990s that the last of these residential schools was closed. The policy was to remove children and to assimilate them. About 150,000 children were placed in these residential schools. One of the things that was done during that time was to enfranchise these children. Great word, huh? We did this by making them choose a last name that had a British sound to it. And that was the name by which they were to be legally known from there on in. And all of their descendants were to be legally known by that name. So we took them away from all of the things that were important to them. I tend to think of loneliness, as I think many of us do, as a lack of satisfying social relationships. This was much more profound than that. And here's the quote from the 79-year-old man who attended the Mohawk Institute residential school for 10 years from age 6 to age 16. He said, and they were given a monetary compensation as part of the apology from the Canadian government, and he said, how do you put a monetary value on losing your beliefs, your language, and your culture? How do you heal from loneliness? So we've got some work to do, certainly in our own country. On the other hand, when we think about place, so those are people growing old in a foreign land. It's just they were born in that foreign land. On the other hand, we've got these idyllic beliefs in Canada about rural places, and I've done some work on people growing old in rural areas. And our stereotype about rural Canada, well, we've got paradoxical ones. We've got one that says that rural people are very well connected and supported. Everybody in rural communities helps one another. They band together. They make sure that everyone is okay. Rural is a good place to grow old. You're not lonely. On the other hand, more recent research has shown that if you live in a rural area, you tend to be a long way from services. You often are a long way from other people. And so you're often quite poorly served. We have some really, really low population density areas in Canada. Interestingly, though, and this gets back to the stereotype to me, rural people in Canada, rural older adults, if you ask them whether they have enough people around them, they're far more likely to say yes than people in the cities. So are they buying into the stereotype? Or is there, in fact, a rural persona in Canada which is stoic and self-sufficient and frankly doesn't wish to have you too close by? So how close is too close is a really interesting question that comes up in rural Canada. I think Mary Pat takes a little pride in being from northern Canada where things are a great distance away. So, international migration and loneliness and thinking about place and how much does place make a difference in how lonely people might be. When we think about international migration these days, and we think about it a lot because of what's going on in various parts of the world, we think about this disruption of people from places. And that disruption can be quite profound, and a different kind of disruption that we've seen as part of the tradition, certainly in Canada, of people coming to a place because there were opportunities in that new place, often in the case of Canada because there was land, and land meant that you could farm, you could support your family, and you could have a good life. So the sense of place can be quite a profound issue for people in terms of their connections. But one of the things that has been part of our thinking about international migration and loneliness is that here too, at least in the world that I inhabit, we've had some stereotypes or some optics around what international migration looks like. And in Canada, because our migrants have tended to come often from a great distance, our ideas have been that people leave the land of their birth, they come to this new place, and at least up until the recent generation, never went back. So you were disconnected from that place and you didn't return to that place. There's a nice work, a piece of work written by Russell King and others, it's a recent one, on loneliness of older Albanian people. And I think that work suggests to us that we need to not think in such kind of black and white terms about migration to a new place. They talk about this optic of the left behind generation. That is, the young people migrate, the older people don't, or they don't migrate until later. And it's not a simple matter of leaving and never returning. What they talk about is the idea of transnational migration, with the example of Albania, where a third of the population has left the country, where most went to adjacent countries, to Greece and to Italy, for example, and sometimes went back and forth, where most had no legal channels for migration, rather different than our stereotype, at least in Canada, of these new opportunities. Where they say most lack a coherent ethnic community identity, which leads to a focus on family as the important group, and they say to a more rapid integration into a new place. So you can't really disconnect place from family connections, from ethnic identity, from how strong the link is back to that initial place. And yet, they talk about the loneliness of these migrants and how they are lonely if they've come to a new place because of the people they've left behind, but that they were lonely when they were in the home country because their children had migrated here. And sometimes, and we see this in our results from our Canadian data, when people come to a new country, they may, at least in the case of Canada, actually live with their adult children and be profoundly lonely. Another stereotype that we Canadians carry with us, because we do in fact feel quite guilty from time to time about the geographic separateness of children and adult parents. So one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind as we theorize loneliness and theorize old age is, what do we expect? What do we expect in terms of the size of the network of people around us, the composition? Is it mostly family members? Is it mostly friends? And what does that network do? I remember one time a visitor from southern Italy was in Edmonton, Alberta, where it is sometimes -40, and it was wintertime, and she said to me, "What do you do with your old people?" And I thought, "What do you mean, what do we do with them?" She said, "I don't see anybody. I don't see any old people. Where do people gather?" Well, I said, "Not in a lovely leafy square in the middle of town with the fountain bubbling. This is a northern cold community." And her vision was a very public later life where people were outside, whether they're sitting together in cafes. And for us, we hoped there was a senior center that had good heat that people could come to. Very different expectation about the size, composition, and visibility of networks. We know we need to think about diversity. We need to think about diversity. We old people are not all the same. The other thing you need to know about me in terms of my own theorizing is I think context is really important. So as Jenny and I were arguing through the theoretical and the empirical in this piece of work that you have in your folder, I said we've got to think about this in terms of the context of one's life that might be important in understanding loneliness. I think to both of us, as we began this paper, we thought the social context had to be really important. What are the important relationships in terms of family, in terms of friends, and thinking about issues related to migration that come up in some of the migration literature, which is if you move to a new place, does your network in the new place, at least for a while, is it often quite small? In the case of Canada, we had a specific immigration policy for many years that was about reuniting families. So as a younger adult, you could apply to bring your parents to Canada under this special rule. What that meant was that often people came and lived with their adult children, at least for a period of time. But community is important as well in terms of this broader context of where people make their connections to others, where they might meet new friends. And the piece that I think is coming up, certainly in the literature recently on immigration and aging, is this broader sociocultural context. And Ness and Christine Dobbs, in a recent article about social networks, I think addressed this very nicely. What are the contexts of the sending country, and how do those translate into the development of particular kinds of social networks of people who come to a new place? They might look quite different to our eyes, and maybe sets of relationships that actually work well for an immigrant that look to us like ones that are rather exclusive. So social networks are important. We can't assume we know which are the best ones. And the other thing that Ness brings up in her work and that is really important is, are you coming from a collectivist or familist society where family is really considered the core social group? And are you coming to a more individualistic society where you're expected to build your own relationships, and those are the important ones? It makes a difference how well you do. You've got the paper in your handout, so I'm not going to spend huge amounts of time there, except where it relates to some of this idea of re-envisioning loneliness. We wanted to address this assumption that if you're an immigrant, you're likely lonelier than if you were born in the country. As you've already seen, there's a pretty profound example in Canada of some of the loneliest people in the country being a small group of people that were born there, but who are growing old in a foreign land. So we needed to kind of deconstruct this notion. We assumed that family and friends and having both of those in your life were going to be important in terms of reducing loneliness. Although as a family scholar, I was a little more cynical, I guess, about the place of families in reducing loneliness than Jenny was. And you'll see how that played out. We were both right in the end. These days, we in our individualistic Canadian society think that community participation is particularly important. People must be engaged, people must volunteer, people must be out there in communities, and that likely would be inversely related to loneliness. And this last one we had much debate over. In Canada, in Western Canada, where I live, there are large communities of people who've come from different parts of Asia. who don't necessarily speak a mainstream English or French language. And we tend to think about people who've emigrated into such a setting as being okay. You've got people around you who speak your language and know your culture. So we had a little debate about whether or not, if most of your friends spoke the same language as you, even if it wasn't one of the official Canadian languages, you wouldn't be lonely. So I'm going to just I'm going to go right past all these methods. They're stunningly interesting, but you can read about them in the paper. But this was a national sample, so it's reasonably representative, we think, of what's going on in Canada in terms of older adults. So I'm going to go right to these findings. What we did in the study that I think is important for you to know is, first we divided people into those who'd been born in Canada and those who hadn't, and then we further subdivided them. And this was Jenny's idea, and I think it was a great idea. So we further divided them with the idea that language and culture of origin, that the further away you got in language and culture of origin from mainstream, whatever that might be, Canadian culture, perhaps the lonelier you might be, in the sense of it being harder to connect. So we had three groups of immigrants. Those who came from an English or French speaking country, mostly Western Europe, where we assumed culture was similar. Those who came from other parts of Europe, where there might be some cultural similarities but not language similarities. And those who came from non-English or French speaking other parts of the world, where we expect the least similarity. So what did we find? We found that immigrants are indeed lonelier than non-immigrants, but those who came from English or French speaking backgrounds were no lonelier than those born in Canada. So it's not just coming to a new place. Loneliness is higher among those two groups who were least like the mainstream culture.
Norah,
yep.
You may have mentioned it and I missed it, but did you look at how long were
Oh, that's a brilliant question, and I wish we could have, and we didn't have those data. And I think the question is, do we look at how long? Did we look at how long people had been in the country? We weren't able to do that. The only thing that gives us some kind of comfort is that this was a very large sample across the whole country, but we would have dearly loved to have done that. You'd think if you'd been in the country 50 years, maybe it didn't matter anymore. And we just didn't know the answer to that. But good question. One of those frustrations of doing an analysis of a secondary data set. And that people who were from those two immigrant groups who were least like mainstream culture had fewer social resources, in that they named fewer family members and fewer friends in terms of numbers, and they were less connected to their communities. Again, this question about maybe those were the groups who were more recently come to Canada, and that's certainly possible. We don't assume, we know we've had waves of immigrants from different parts of the world, and it may well be that they were the most recent immigrants, so we don't know the answer to that. We, in the regression analyses we did, and again, I'm not sure all this is going to really connect for everybody, so let me see if I can highlight them. What we did is try to take all these descriptive things into account in these models, and we found that when we put immigrant group or location of home country into our model, that those two groups, the other European and non-European immigrants, were significantly lonelier than those born in Canada. Then we brought in the social variables, and there was one finding that I found particularly interesting as a family scholar that I think we need to know more about. For the most part, having more relatives and friends, having contact with them, and being satisfied with your contact with those people reduced the likelihood that you'd be lonely. That makes perfect sense, it seems to me. There's one exception. There's this little crossed out piece here. And this little crossed out piece says that there was no difference. It didn't matter how much you saw or talked to your children. It simply didn't affect your loneliness. Now, what is that about? Well, I guess for some people, having a lot of contact with your children wasn't the best thing. And for some people, having a little bit of contact with your children, but good quality contact, was wonderful. The other piece of information we did not have is whether people lived with their children and what that might mean, or how far away they lived from their children. We know that families are incredibly complex, and I think we need to be very careful as our social policy moves along by default, really suggesting that families are the key support group to older people and by older people, because that's certainly where we're going in Canada, and I expect here as well. Families are incredibly complex, and we know that if people develop dependencies and frailties in later life, it's often family members that they wish to turn to or need to turn to. We've got to keep an eye on that one. The community context was important, but didn't add a lot to our understanding of loneliness. And we got a little bit more understanding of this whole idea of being somewhat isolated, in that most of your friends in this new place speak a language other than the main language of the country. So when we look to Vancouver, where we have a large proportion of immigrants from China, and we say, looks like everybody's okay because other people speak their language, we may want to look again, because it may in fact feel like you are isolated from the rest of the country if you can't go into shops outside of your neighborhood and have someone understand you. So I'm going to finish Mary Pat with no, I'm not. There we go. Some questions that have come to me as I've looked at this material, and I think they're ones where we need to, that for me, I would want to address if I was going to think about loneliness and theorizing loneliness in the next piece of work I might do. Again, going back to Canada, because this is where these data are from, we know that recent waves of immigrants have come more likely from countries and cultures that are quite different from our previous immigrants. We also know that people now are coming to Canada for very different reasons. We have economic migrants who are coming with resources and investing in the country, and we had a big wave of immigrants from China, from Hong Kong, as things were changing politically there. But we also know that people are migrants because they're leaving terrible places. And they're coming not because they really necessarily wish to be in Canada, but because they cannot be where they used to live. Very different reasons for coming. Will some of these people be lonelier in their later life? We don't know, but we need to better understand. We need to better understand, in my view, the family context of people who are immigrants. What are their expectations about the engagement with their family members? How do they differ than the expectations of others about what children might do in particular? How do our patterns of having children or not having children even make it likely that you will have a child available to you in your late life should you need support? Last few months ago, Nessa and I and some others did a kind of policy relevant paper as part of the Foresight Aging series, and ours was one on intergenerational relationships. And a little piece that we took from that paper was that you've got among women in the UK who are now past their childbearing years, we talk about how people aren't having children anymore, and the numbers of children are getting smaller. Well, it turns out there's a really bimodal distribution. 20% of those women have never had a child, so they are childless. The rest, on average, have 2. So it depends on how we look at our statistics. So you've got a group of people where their families have no children and hence no grandchildren. You've got a group of people where they do have children and likely grandchildren. Quite a different family late life experience for those people. And finally, do we need to get off the bandwagon of social community participation is the only way to go? That seems to be where we are at the moment. I come from a background where I've done a lot of work in rural Canada, where we see these stoic people who go to town once a week because they need to buy their groceries and, thank you very much, don't wish to be engaged. We need to think again about, or some more, I think, about what is age friendly and to whom, and what age-friendly might mean, for example, to an Aboriginal older person who has been in a community that has been unfriendly for most of his life. What does age-friendly look like for that person? What might age-friendly look like to a recent immigrant from Syria who has lived for a period of time in a refugee camp, who's had some sense of community there, who's thrust into an individualistic culture where they're expected to create their relationships and do those on their own? I think we've got some profound questions to ask. And I like the idea of loneliness helping us to get into some of those questions. And that's kind of where I stand on the re-envisioning loneliness. For me, it gets us into some of those questions about families, about immigrants, and about place. So for you new scholars coming along, I think there's at least 20 or 30 more years of research that we could be doing on some of these questions. And I'll look forward to our conversation if we have a chance. And thank you all very much.